I may disappoint you, Carla, because what the burden of going last, obviously, is you're all chomping at the bit to ask questions, but the privilege is I get to comment on what others have said before me. And so I'm going to throw out what I had planned just to take some liberties, at least part of the way. You know, it's interesting you mentioned Annette Reed's book. I think you can hear me. I'm on my, yeah, you mentioned Annette Reed's book because I also just looked at the book. And what's fascinating to me is that I am one of those people by education that only thinks in terms of stereotypes and generalizations about everything. And I'm very data-driven. And one of the great lessons in her book is don't be. So for instance, I just assume that by definition, if Sally Hemings is a 15-year-old girl and she's a slave of Thomas Jefferson, a 48-year-old white slave owner, it must have been rape. But she actually, the author, provides a very compelling argument why it wasn't rape, why this young woman was making intelligent, sophisticated, voluntary decisions for herself about what she wanted to have for her children and her life. And how important it is. This is what she said when she won the Pulitzer. If I teach anything, it's like, get rid of the stereotypes and generalizations, understand that there are personal narratives here. And don't ever get tired of the personal narratives. And I guess in part that's an answer to Skip's last question, which is why do those people care so much about their personal history and much less about the DNA data? It's the same reason. As a communications device, we're all much more influenced by a compelling narrative than we are by statistics and data. And so I'm going to violate that rule and violate a rule that I've always used at the Innocence Project to do educational work, which is, you know, skip the data and go right to telling these compelling stories of people who are wrongly convicted and spent all these years in prison or on death row and miss their families and everybody died and then they get out. Okay, I'm going to skip all of that, okay? Because quite honestly, my work is actually fairly trivial in this sense. It's not controversial. Our work has exonerated 240 people, including 17 from death row. We all know DNA got them out. What's more compelling about our work is using DNA as a light bulb to illuminate what went wrong that got them in the first place, and then come up with recommendations for reforming criminal justice, and which is fairly straightforward stuff now and very well accepted. It's not controversial. Our biggest problem is not controversy, it's resistance. People just don't want to change. Even here in enlightened Massachusetts, we now have 46 states in the country that have post-conviction DNA statutes. Massachusetts, along with Alabama, Oklahoma, and Alaska, does not. Go figure. You know, we were talking about databases. Some states have been very concerned about limiting the use of these forensic databases. Massachusetts created a statute with a big exception, which is for criminal identification purposes or anything else humanitarian. Big exception, okay? What does that mean? So, you know, so our problem is resistance, not controversy. But what I do want to talk a little bit about, which I hadn't intended to talk about, is hype versus reality. Because a lot of the speakers have alluded to that. They've told you about limitations of DNA in the medical context. Okay, that except for a handful of diseases and disorders, we don't have enough yet that you can make these kind of green light, red light decisions. Skip was talking about ancestral DNA, and the truth is that if you go back 7 generations, right, you're talking about 128 genetic donors, right? Great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, right? There's 128 of them across, and if he does the DNA of his mother's line and his father's father's line, he's got 2 128ths, or only 1/64th of all of his genetic complement. So it's giving you some information, but not everything. Now, contrast to the medical and ancestral context, criminal adjudications. Okay, in our work, when we do DNA testing, we can say with 100% certainty, right, whether it was his DNA or it wasn't his DNA found in the semen recovered from a 90-year-old rape victim. There's no guesswork, there's no frequencies at that point, probabilities are irrelevant, and so we can say with great certainty, he didn't do it, he's innocent. On the other hand, as we've done with 100 of our cases, we've then gone on to identify the real perpetrator with 100% certainty, okay? And so that's fairly unusual. The problem is that once you get that kind of unusual certainty, unlike some of these other applications, people then try and exploit it all kinds of ways. And what I want to talk about a little bit now are the outer edges of the Innocence Project's work, but actually how it's getting exploited, what the concerns are, what the dangers. The last speaker alluded to some of it, but the proliferation of forensic DNA databases is a real concern to the population at large. I haven't even made up my own mind yet, so I have a series of questions, okay, without answers, but just so you think about it. Because most people say, hey, what's the big deal? You know, as it was said in the New York Times article, you know, who cares if we have your DNA? If you didn't commit the crime, you've got nothing to worry about, right? Well, in 1994, we set up this National DNA Data Bank for criminal identification purposes. And a bunch of us sat around a room and discussed it, from law enforcement, from crime laboratories, from the FBI, and everyone thought it's going to be a very limited database because we care about privacy, we care about the Fourth Amendment, we want to have reasonable searches and seizures, only convicted sex offenders. Well, that was the sense in 1994, and no one thought it was going to go much further. But, you know, DNA creep, you know, makes us all rather naive, okay? So you fast forward 15 years, and it's no longer just convicted sex offenders. Most states now, it's everybody who's been convicted of any felony at all. A lot of states moved on to misdemeanors, juvenile offenders, anybody who ever got probation, anybody who committed even a automobile infraction. They've included those to the DNA data banks. And now, of course, we have 15 states which have arrestee databases. So people who haven't even been convicted of any crime giving a sample. And the question is, well, what's the big deal? They haven't been, you know, if they didn't commit the crime, they have nothing to worry about. But think about some of the new databases that exist, not just the ones already mentioned, and you may immediately have certain concerns. We now have databases of elimination samples. So when there's a rape case done in a lot of jurisdictions, they take a sample from the rape victim, they'll take an elimination sample from her husband or sexual partner, right? Because if the defendant is excluded as the source of the semen, they want to make sure it's not a false exclusion. Maybe the perpetrator didn't ejaculate and the semen we're seeing belongs to the husband, right? So they take their samples as well. They have to do that. Well, they don't throw them out and destroy them. They keep them. It becomes part of the DNA data bank. As a detective in New York said to us, said, hey, today's victim is tomorrow's perp. It's that simple, and we've got to be prepared for it. So they keep elimination samples. You know, you say arrestee samples aren't a big deal. Well, you know, we did a study in New York. Our illustrious ex-attorney general, who went on to become a governor for a short while, did do a famous study, though, on stop and frisk. And what he found out is that all other variables being equal, that if you were black or Hispanic, you were much more likely to be stopped and frisked by the police. And if you're much more likely to be stopped and frisked, you're much more likely to be arrested, which means you're going to have a data bank, ultimately, which is much more weighted to people of color than to everybody in a fair way. Couple with that the notion of telling the police that all you have to do is arrest somebody to get the DNA, and you're inviting something which this country saw for a long time, to wit, pretext arrests. Because all you have to do is arrest somebody on any probable cause, you get the DNA. Sure, you drop the charges, you can let them go after, but you got the DNA. And given this prevailing notion now that once you get it, you can keep it forever, okay, that's what happens. Then you have DNA dragnets. In Miami, Florida, there was a group of women raped. They saw a black man fleeing the scene, so they knew it was a black man. They went to the black part of Miami. 1,400 black men without exception all volunteered to give their DNA. They were all excluded. They finally caught the real assailant in the act on crime number 8, but did they destroy those 1,500 samples? No, they became the usual suspect database. And then you get to phenotype profiles, which is the latest thing, using ancestry DNA or other medical DNA. You see a stain in the street left from the perpetrator who struggled with the homicide victim. It doesn't get a hit in a data bank, so you want to find out as much as you can about who left that blood drop. You might want to find out that she has the BRCA1 gene, which is a predisposition for breast cancer, and you may want to go to certain women's clinics looking for people, and then start following a lot of different people until you find the right one. Or then maybe the person has the 2 mutations for Gaucher's, and you may want to go to the clinic that does certain treatments for people like that, and start looking at lots of different people. Even the HIPAA rules say you can't use that information and the genetic discrimination law says you can't use information for employment or for insurance. But there's a huge exception for law enforcement, okay? And so people have to turn over medical records. These are serious questions that could affect all of you, and you have to think about them. All I can tell you is that, when you talk about arrestee databases and everybody says, don't worry, it's only a problem if you're going to commit a crime, just look at what happened when certain countries were asked their law enforcement agencies to volunteer to give their DNA profiles for the national database so they could be eliminated. Let's say you're doing a burglary scene, you want to eliminate the police to make sure the DNA wasn't there from the police processing the scene so you don't have a false exclusion. Well, the police of England and Scotland said no, voluntarily. They had to have a statute, and it's still being negotiated. Last week, the National Police Union of Australia said, no way, and we'll fight it up through the highest courts. And I'll just leave you with this thought. Could you imagine here, if somebody asked the police union of the Boston Police Department or the NYPD if all their members would consent to including their DNA in a citywide or nationwide databank? Thank you.